The Lost Year, Chapter 12, Captive. Merlin groaned as she sat up. Her head felt tender as she poked at it. Bruised. That tracked. The last thing she remembered was blinding pain across her temples. They'd been ambushed. That much she remembered. She'd tried to stick close to Arthur, but ended up next to Leon. She'd managed to keep an eye on Arthur, taking out a few crossbowmen and archers hidden in trees, and dropping large branches on a few more skilled warriors. She had no idea where the rock had come from, or if she'd been hit because someone had seen what she'd been doing. At the moment, all she knew was that she was alone in a cell she didn't recognize. The walls were solid stone, and the door solid steel. That alone allowed her to whisper a spell, snapping off the cuffs around her wrists. She stood, rubbing at developing bruises. Her hair fell in her face, and she grumbled, pulling off her neckerchief and using it to tie back the mass of black. She really needed to cut it soon. Maybe she'd asked Gwen when they got back to Camelot. It had been tied up when she was last conscious. Something had pulled out her braid. She was lucky she hadn't broken something falling off her horse, as she likely had. Pressing an ear to the door, she listened for anyone on the other side. 20 minutes went by before she deemed it was safe enough to whisper another spell and gently pull the now unlocked cell open just a crack. The rest of the dungeon was no less squalid than her cell, but she did spot something happening a few cells down across the hall. Sir Leon was being dragged out of a cell. He went with dignity, and Merlin frowned as she pulled the door to her cell shut again. This complicated things. If she had been captured alone, then she could have crept out without raising an alarm. But if Leon knew they'd taken her too, how could she explain how she'd escaped? Running an anxious hand through her hair only yielded fingers tangled in it. She yanked hard, coming away with several strands of hair and a pin she used to keep it back. She frowned down at it and let out a breath. It was worth a shot. Leon groaned as he was tossed back into the cell. They'd questioned him, because of course they had. He'd given them nothing. They weren't particularly skilled at interrogation. But he was growing concerned. One of the men who'd been standing by while he was beaten had suggested torturing the other prisoner for information, since Leon would not break. He'd had Merlin over his shoulder when he went down. It tracked that if they'd gotten him, they'd gotten her as well. Sure, these men hadn't been skilled, simply using fists as their best form of torment, but Merlin was a healer, not built for this type of thing. A physician, not a fighter. She would not hold up well under torture, nor should she have to. He tensed as a soft thunk sounded from the door behind him. Scrambling to his feet, he readied himself for another bout of pain, and blinked when the door opened all the way to Merlin, tucking a pin back into her hair. "Sir Leon, do you know if they got anyone else?" she asked without preamble. He blinked at her, her words taking a moment to penetrate his brain. "They only mentioned one other prisoner. I assumed that was you. How did you do that?" he demanded, but she nodded and turned. "Come on," she whispered. Leon followed her down the hall of cells. She held up a hand and he stopped. He hated feeling helpless, but he'd lost his sword when he was rendered unconscious. He could hear men speaking around the corner, but not what they were saying. "Wait here," Merlin muttered, and slipped around the corner before Leon could catch her. She was a lot faster than anyone ever gave her credit for, and more stealthy, Leon realized as he peeked around the corner and spotted her, only because he was looking for her. She had somehow slipped into the shadows without alerting either man on guard, though they did seem to be rather engrossed in their dice game. His eyes slipped back to Merlin, and he blinked. She wasn't where she had been. Scanning the room almost frantically, he found her again, nearly all the way across the room. How had she gotten there so quickly? She shoved her hair up under her scarf and pulled it low so it hid the rather colorful bruise on her forehead. Then she grabbed up a stone pitcher off a table near the door and seemed to test the weight of it for a moment. She hunched her shoulders down and fixed her eyes on the floor, carefully opening the door out of the dungeons and closing it so it made a noise. "Oh, they finally sent something pretty from the kitchens, eh, Bert?" the first guard called, catching his friend's attention. Bert looked up and whistled lowly. "Come closer, pretty kitty," he rumbled, and Leon tasted bile at the back of his throat, especially when Merlin meekly shuffled forward, never once looking up. "Oh, don't be so shy now, sweet thing," the first guard said, standing and striding over to Merlin with confidence. He reached out, and Leon reached for a sword he no longer had. Merlin, though, was ready. She swung the stone pitcher, taking the first guard clean across the face, leaving him crumpled on the floor. His friend swore and moved for his weapon. Merlin hurled the stone pitcher, catching him full in the head. He, too, went down, though he looked more stunned than out cold like his friend. Merlin darted across the distance between them and wrapped one arm around the man's throat, using her other as an anchor to keep him from breaking her grip. He was purple in moments, and she dropped him prone next to his fellow. "Okay, now you can come out," Merlin said, shaking her head, her hair falling loose behind her again. Leon blinked as she grabbed the first guard by the foot and dragged him into an open cell, swiping the keys from his belt as she did. "Are you going to help me, or just stand there?" Leon snapped into action, seizing the second guard and tossing him into a cell with his fellows. He stared as Merlin divested them of weapons, coin purses, and anything else that might be halfway useful they had on them. "How did you do that?" he asked again. Merlin shrugged. "Learning how to heal someone means you also know the easiest ways to hurt someone," she said, as though that was common knowledge. "He'll have a rough cough for the next few days," she pointed to the second guard. "Him," she began, indicating the first. "If he wakes up, he'll live. But the pitcher was a little heavier than I expected. I might have cracked his skull," she admitted with a frown. Leon gasped as she shrugged. Leon gaped as she shoved one of the guard's sword belts into his hands, shooing him out of the cell and locking it behind them with her stolen keys. That wasn't what I meant." It hadn't been, but it was good to know that Merlin could wreak such havoc in such a small amount of time. "They had to know who they were guarding. How did they not recognize you?" "People see what they expect to see," Merlin said simply. "Let's get out of here." They checked the other cells before they left. None of them were occupied. Leon was bruised and tired, but more than anything, he was confused.